Welcome. Today's post is NHL, Scary Mask Deconstruction. Published on May 14, 2023. Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, debuted on April 5, 1974. 2 days later the final NHL game with a maskless goalie was played. On June 22, 1982, the Detroit Red Wings were purchased, and less than 2 months later on August 13, Jason wears a Red Wings hockey mask for the first time in the movie, Friday the 13th. Here are the topics we'll be decoding today. You can always find this list in the description below. If you enjoy this video, please press the like button, and subscribe for weekly full-length blog posts, and shorter, more shareable videos. Let's begin. Never ignore the basic definition of symbolism. The NHL is an excellent example to study for any would-be decoders in my small audience. What could be symbolized by hockey? What is hockey famous for in relation to other major sports? Of all pro sports, hockey holds the distinction as the one most associated with violence. The screw-up many would make in trying to decode something like this is ignoring the basic attributes of the thing. What we see in pop culture about the NHL being violent is because whatever the com is, it must be associated with violence. We now have a foundation to begin decoding without even taking a single famous hockey story into account. The players are famous for taking teeth. A hockey smile defines with pride the sacrifices made for the game. What kind of comms would be a natural fit with this sport? If we can decode teeth, then it'll go a long way in understanding hockey. Teeth. I'll return to hockey shortly, and when I do, everything about teeth in relation to hockey will make perfect sense. A tooth symbolizes someone who is a dug-in plant. It's a symbol for people who are hard to remove. The old saying, like pulling teeth. Defining a hard thing to accomplish is a good way to think about it. Thus often when someone has been successfully removed from a position of power after a long fight, the marker will be of tooth removal. Few people fit this bill better than Anthony Weiner. Weiner is famous for losing his job and being convicted after sexting a child. September 16, 2015, Anthony Weiner loses job due to sexting a child. September 16, 2015, girl yanks loose tooth out with drone. Notice how Drudge placed them next to one another. Drudge does this frequently as it's almost like a guide for comms-aware people to understand which story is being used to mark what event. The symbolism is also perfect. A young girl, just like the child that cost Weiner his job, yanks out a tooth using a drone. The story spreads virally and people who would never openly discuss Weiner would happily talk about a cute story about a father helping a girl yank a tooth out. Now you understand the basic symbol, but let's go through a few more quick ones. Another perfect example, Trump tweets about Nancy losing her teeth and pairs it with an article about a congressman leaving her party. Another one. Cuomo chipped a tooth during coronavirus. Given what I've decoded about coronavirus ops, this fits perfectly. Or how about the dentist that turned Michael Jackson from the widely worshipped king of pop to a laughed-at child molester? However, none of these are good examples of hockey, are they? It's about sex. Is that the only way to remove someone from a position? No. One more tooth example. This one is far closer to the hockey puck. A dentist who extracted tooth on hoverboard sentenced to 12 years. Notice the details. Darn near killed some people. Alaskan dentist Seth Lookhart was sentenced to 12 years for extracting a tooth July 2016. Seth plus Look plus murder plus 2016. Does that ring a bell at all? Know any famous Seths that died July of 2016? July 2016 equals Seth Rich murdered. July 10, 2016. Seth Rich's death, DNC Data Director of New Voter Registration. July 11, 2016, CrowdStrike paid $98,849.84 by DNC. August 2, 2016, Sean Lucas death, DNC process server and close friend of Seth Rich. August 3, 2016, CrowdStrike again paid by DNC. Seth Rich, WikiLeaks leaker, was a perfect symbol for someone difficult to remove and yet was. His removal would be a natural fit for teeth removal symbolism. Hockey, which has a focus on removing teeth with violence, has a high likelihood to be tied to these kinds of ops. Now, while I'm on the subject of Seth Rich, it is worth mentioning the ops tied to removing him were in the comms sector long before it happened. Notice the article. Seth Rich was called Panda. Article says Clinton's vase data pulled by Seth Rich was grabbed by a panda and should shoot the panda. Which is exactly what happened. Hockey likely exists, at least in part, to symbolize the battle in removing hard-to-remove plants. With that in mind, the symbol of a hockey mask is critical. It's a symbol of horror for a good reason. The historic moments of these horror face guards are not only well documented but show up on lists as among the most famous moments in hockey. What was the 48th greatest moment in all of hockey? The final goalie to go maskless. April 7, 1974. Final maskless goalie NHL. April 5, 1974. Stephen King debut, Carrie. The symbolism of a mask is in hiding identity. Look again at that sequence. Carrie White sets people on fire in Stephen King's debut. The maskless Penguins lose to Flames 2 days later, final game of season. As in, because people were exposed, not wearing a mask, they would get set on fire. What was exposed at the time? What was on the road to being exposed? Symbolism of the then upcoming MK Ultra D class. The timetable fits perfectly with both publication dates, and the symbolism of the film also matches. Abuse is how murderers are created. The gym where she becomes a murderer is called the Bates Gym. Bates, like in the famous movie Psycho. A movie that was famous for just how mentally disturbed the antagonist was. Associating the systematically abused Carrie with Psycho gives context for how to create a psycho. It's done with networks of clowns coordinating the abuse of a child from birth till they become twisted enough to be a psycho. They are then wielded like a weapon by a handler and set loose at the behest of the one that pays them, but that's best discussed in one of my many MK Ultra posts. Carrie was tied to maskless hockey players. A symbol of being exposed in these activities and being taken by flames. I want to pause on the fact that Carrie was the debut of Stephen King. The beginning of the most successful horror author of all time with Carrie surely means this story was particularly meaningful. The 1974 book, same year MK Ultra first came to public attention, was then turned into a 1976 film. I've gone over the 1976 Carrie White comms a few times. It became critically important in 1977 because that was the year of the MK Ultra hearing. The very thing Carrie was sending comms about. Given Carrie came out in 1976, which then established Carrie White as a symbol of MK Ultra. It's natural in 1977 the biggest movies would invoke it to discuss what was happening in regard to exposure. The most popular film series of all time, at its core, invoked it. Carrie White was the crucial cipher to unlock not just 1977 Star Wars but of the second most popular film that year. Both were released the same week. 1976, Carrie White is MK Ultra's psychopathic main character of Stephen King film. May 19, 1977, Smokey and the Bandit, steals Carrie in White from government, second biggest 1977. May 25, 1977. Star Wars, Luke steals Carrie in White from government. Both films involve stealing Carrie in White from the government. The point is the data about Carrie, Ultra, being taken away from the government's hands. Let's return to hockey. If you look up Andy Brown you will find endless articles talking about him as the final maskless hockey player. But 1974 was only the final NHL game he played maskless. He moved to another league. Andy Brown retired in 1977. I want to really decode the 1977 aspect for you because the more you understand these comms, the more context you have to the hockey comms alongside them. The hockey comms involved the end of being exposed. The symbolism tying these two Carrie White films is more than just the basic details of each. Jackie Gleason was the famous Moon in Honeymooners. Stealing Carrie in White from the moon in Smokey and the Bandit is the same as what happens in Star Wars. Stealing Carrie in White from what was thought of as a moon. Stealing culture, i.e., Carrie White from the government. White equals exposure. The method for doing this was Luke Skywalker and Burt Reynolds. But Reynolds had recently had famous symbolism tied to exposure. Likely the 1972 exposure was a message sent in comms about the handling of MK Ultra material. Why him? First role as the star was as a CIA agent and had a famous mustache, but if that was everything it could have been countless other stars to send the message. Burt Reynolds had another symbol that made this 1977 connection meaningful. Often major stars have birthdates tied to famous events as their core symbol. February 5, 1936. Japan, Island, Pro Baseball founded. +6. February 11, 1936. Treasure Island, San Francisco dredging begins to build the artificial island. February 11, 1936. Burt Reynolds born. I'll be going over this one extensively in a future post, but the symbol is in the building of Japan. Sports are the core of ops for a country. The building of Japan was a major part of the solution to where to put Carrie White, as this was the exchange for handling data. Star Wars on the other hand sent comms of a solution in the farmer Luke Skywalker. Farmer symbolized Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter created the DOE/Q clearance. August 3, 1977. Senate hearing on Cultra. August 3, 1977. DOE created /Q clearance to handle nuclear material. The method for handling Cultra material was in creating Q clearance. Nuclear material moved to Colorado. May 25, 1977. Star Wars, Luke steals Carrie in White. May 26, 1977. Hockey Avco final game. May 26, 1977. Son of Sam schizophrenia diagnosis. May 26, 1977. Shining, Stanley Hotel Colorado added to the historic registry. What was that about the Stanley Cup Hotel? The Stanley Hotel is also the Overlook Hotel from Stephen King's 1977 book The Shining. Most commonly in pop culture tied to Stanley Kubrick's adaptation. Com. What happened day it was founded? July 4, 1909. Stanley Hotel/Overlook Hotel opened. July 4, 1909. Me-6 founded. 5 Eyes. The Me-6 connection implies the hotel was used for ops which both Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick commented on with their own comms. Given this was 1909, and they set up an organization for spying, what is the most likely op the UK, Rothschild home, would be preparing for? Just so happens to be the ultimate tooth removal, com. June 21, 1911. RMS Olympic, floating hotel, maiden voyage from England to New York. June 22, 1911. Coronation King George. June 22, 1911. Largest electric clock in Britain set into motion. June 25, 1911. Stanley Hotel explosion. Titanic. Astor had to be removed to create the Fed because he held the strings on the right wing of Congress due to his hotel blackmail ops. There were many levels to this operation and this is another one. I've decoded Titanic extensively. This hotel appears to have been used to convey the methodology. That gas explosion is the most famous event in the hotel history. Part of the ops I decoded already involved damaging the Olympic and then forcing the owner to switch ships to the identical Titanic. It forced them into an insurance scam as it would bankrupt them, but it was really a trick all to engineer a situation to remove Astor. Me-6 was likely created for this purpose. This may explain the symbolism of an ocean of blood leaving the elevator doors in Shining. It's clear UK ops were involved as they were the ones that slammed into Titanic's sister ship and then refused to pay damages, dooming the White Star Line into bankruptcy, which was the situation necessary to force them into a deal. September 20, 1911 is when the Hotel Olympic crashed, setting things in motion. Check this post for an extensive decode on this, as it's a massive topic. I can further confirm the Shining connection to Me 6 through Stanley Kubrick's casting. He picked the first actor to ever play James Bond as the manager of the hotel. Ullman, remind you of any other comms I've covered about MK data being moved around? If not, I'll explain more in depth later. So many of these puzzle pieces can be decoded extensively, so it's hard to know when to stop. James Bond is of course Me 6, so having him as the manager of the hotel that opened the same day Me 6 began is an unlikely coincidence. A secret agent that removes targets. It is accomplished with a worldwide network, which may be where Olympic drew its name. It required getting Astor to Egypt, which is perhaps why right after the clock started, Mars meteorite fell in Egypt. I'm sure you noticed, Stanley, not just the hotel, but also the director of The Shining in Kubrick. The most famous MK film of all time is Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick. In fact, now we just need to look at other famous Stanleys, and see if they are invoking the same comm. Streetcar Named Desire involves Stanley driving Blanche into insanity. Ends with an insane asylum. And as these kinds of comms are phonetic, that means Stan Lee equals Stanley. Which explains his connection in creating endless superhero characters. Many are symbols of ops. But there's still one more Stanley. May 23, 1980, Shining Stanley Kubrick Stanley Hotel. May 24, 1980. First of 4 straight Stanley Cups won. Top 10 most famous hockey moment of all time in overtime. Stanley Cup. Most famous one by some measures too. Within 1 day of release. Given this is hockey's top prize, it implies these kinds of ops are at the core of what hockey is. March 17, 1894. First Stanley Cup playoff game occurs. March 12, 1894. Coca-Cola is sold in bottles for the first time. Candy store Vicksburg. This was when Coca-Cola had cocaine in it. They made lots of cocaine as a byproduct of creating Coke, as it gives it the taste. Given the way drugs are used to MK people, the timing connection with the first Stanley Cup could mean it was part of a drug push originally. The Simpsons Shining parody opens with this joke. I'll tell you what, we come back and everyone's slaughtered, I owe you a Coke. Though this could be a coincidence, I think it's more likely a wink to the history. The point of sending a message with Shining was likely in the ending for each. In the original novel the hotel explodes, but in the Kubrick interpretation, it ends with the kid covering his tracks to avoid the stalking killer. Shining book was 1977. This is the year of the MK Ultra hearing, which was followed the next day by when DOE/Q clearance began. January 20, 1977, Jimmy Carter inauguration. January 28, 1977, Shining, Colorado Overlook Hotel/Stanley Hotel covering tracks. Changes in the way data was handled as nuclear material was moved to Colorado, same as Stanley Hotel. 1977 was focused on Carrying Carrie White. A story that begins by literally stealing secret data. A rescue of the data so as to use it as terrorists. Shining was simply an extension of the comms already sent. The concept of shining is approximate to comms awareness. Note the basic power of it involves talking without talking. Just like comms do. People use such techniques to become stars. Shining stars. As in the people to be exposed and in danger had things continued with the data within reach of law enforcement. So they moved it overseas to Japan. Hence Japan Research Institute of Polar Research finding an Allen meteorite, same name of the only place widely reported in 1977 for MK happened. Remember, August of 1977 the big conversation in the Senate was the Allen Memorial Institute, that name would be a shorthand for MK at that time. So Japan finding a famous meteorite with that name at that time. It's just very clear. August 3, 1977, MK Ultra hearing Senate. August 3, 1977, James Bond Spy Who Loved Me USA premiere, story about nuclear material that could trigger a war. August 4, 1977, DOE/Q clearance. This was around the same time as the nuclear material was moved due to DOE changes/Q clearance. This moving of data is also reflected in The Shining, which was cast with the original James Bond as manager. One of the most prominent conspiracy theories about The Shining involves the removal of Dopey the Dwarf sticker from Danny's room. Danny's room has a bunch of stickers of Snoopy, Mickey, and one sticker of Dopey the Dwarf is removed by the end of the film. The popular theory on this is he has stopped being a dope, but like with most comms there is another level to it. The symbol is likely in the removal of data. Dwarf mining diamond symbolism is in the people who work on data collection. So he becomes less of a dope, but that's only a small part of the message. Japan had already been a key ally for global ops for decades. Miss Universe. Understanding the growth of Japan in relation to most countries will help clarify their special position. For example, notice China, which had an economic flat lines until the 1990s. Why was Japan so much bigger than Japan for so long? China eventually overtook Japan, but that's something I discuss/decode in other posts. It only makes the point stronger here because if they could do so much so suddenly, why then did one so outperform the other for so many decades? It's tempting to argue that Japan simply produced better quality or something, but data handling is the real answer. July 15, 1959, steelworkers strike begins, the largest strike in U.S. history. July 24, 1959, Japan wins Miss Universe contest. First Asian winner. The symbolism is of picking Japan over the USA. The steel strike allowed Japan to pick up the massive amount of business which would cripple the industry in the USA while creating the foundation of Japan's modern mega economy. A whole new avenue to send comms I found here. How beauty pageants play into things. The use of foreign allies to handle data was effectively the mask. The symbol of the data moving was represented by a jump. Most famous TV jump is Fonzie over Sharks, which happened in 1977. Fixing, exposure, hence the calm about accidental nudity. Hockey masks. I covered when hockey masks became mandatory, but what about when they started? That distinction goes to 1959. Within 1 week of the first time photos were taken of the dark side of the moon. The symbol of the dark side of the moon is of secrets. Because of tidal lock it's never seen, but here we see it for the first time, and it's time to the first pro hockey mask. Hockey goalie masks are synonymous with horror. Obviously, there was a purpose to this, so let's consider the origin with Jason and Friday the 13th. I already decoded the film as it represented a shell comm, with what amounts to a psyop on a character named Shelly, who then turns into a killer. This was the debut of the Jason hockey mask. Shining also had a Shelly as a star, and in each case it represented people acting as shells for others. Specifically, the mask is a Red Wings hockey mask. June 22, 1982. Red Wings purchased by Mike Ilitch, owner of Little Caesars. August 13, 1982. Friday the 13th Part 3 Introduction of Red Wings hockey mask. October 22, 1982. Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Sports teams often go decades without changing hands. For the Red Wings to get sold the same time the symbol gets turned into a horror icon. This suggests a change in ops. This change turns Red Wings into winners. Under Little Caesars, the Red Wings went from the bottom to the top of the league in just a few years. The symbolism comms sent by Little Caesars are likely to unlock some of the ops tied to the Red Wings. During the peak years, one of the unique things about Little Caesars was their use of Simon Says games. This is an established comm I've gone over before. Symbolism of a person being programmed to do a desired action. Tagline, do what Simon says, or you go down the drain. In the MK world, this amounts to a child being introduced to criminals and drugs with an understanding they will pick up the behaviors. It's part of conditioning, concept outlined in the Bourne Identity. The overarching goal is to make it so the target decides to act. This allows the string puller to commit no crime yet accomplish their goal by having someone else commit a crime. That's the essence of MKUltra. The richest in the world fund networks of clowns around the world to raise monsters that can be deployed against enemies. Mad Max 2, the most popular one, uses hockey goalie symbolism as the mask of the villain. The leader of a group that rapes and kills for gasoline in a post-apocalyptic world. That was US released in 1982. Same time frame as Friday the 13th Part 3. Both of these horror staples had the bright idea at the same time to make the villain synonymous with hockey masks. One of the more famous early anime Fist of the North Star was built off the Mad Max 2 recipe. This is relevant because as stated before Japan was heavily tied to the surveillance ops. Which means it was likely connected to those same types of hockey ops. Patterns demonstrate the ops tied to a handful of companies like the Jump and Nintendo. Jumpman. If I overlay hockey plus Jump plus Nintendo. October 11, 1984. Fist of the North Star debut anime. October 11, 1984. Super Mario, first hockey game, greatest start to any hockey star in history. It gets tricky to define at times because Japan is mostly known for baseball. All sports are tied to comms, but baseball is most associated with companies and blackmail. This fits Japan based on my decodes, but notice they released Super Mario Bros. On Friday the 13th. The game that catapulted them over Atari. Picking that famously unlucky date could be coincidence, but notice they released Friday the 13th on Friday the 13th in other installments. Not every installment mind you, but many of them. In 1985, they released it on 322. Which is a comm I go over in a few posts as its skull and bones. A symbol of taking someone else's secrets. Taking the skeletons in the closet. This goes back a long way. September 3, 1946. Operation Paperclip classified program to integrate World War II enemies. September 3, 1946. First president of Nintendo birth. Obviously paperclip ops weren't just about integrating former Nazis. Plus America was more involved in post-World War II Japan than in Germany, so it would be strange for them to not have incorporated some of them into the ops. Then not long after the steel industry moves from the US domination to Japan. The coordination of this change of wealth would create enemies and broadly defines the sides. This is particularly meaningful in 1985. Notice the giant Rob the Robot in Rocky IV. I go over the comms in other posts, and it amounted to a collaboration to promote the Japanese tech industry. This was at the expense of Atari, which quickly died. I believe some in the Japanese tech companies were already tied to surveillance ops, and so as tech flourished Japan agreed to handle the data. I believe they vastly expand spy ops with tech in exchange for success in the industries. Ops in exchange for media promotion. Remember Chernobyl was the very next year. And after that the USSR fell. What happened right before Russia fell? Russia decided to partner with Nintendo. November 1989. Fall of the Russian Berlin Wall. November 1989. Tetris released. This connection goes even deeper as this week I learned about the Apple II designer Steve Wozniak holding the high score on Tetris. A feat he held for over 15 years as Nintendo confirmed his high score, which was done while flying Mach speed in a jet. He gave Bush and Gorbachev Game Boys and Tetris. A week later Bush went to the hospital and was pictured playing one. If you've been following my decodes, you know many of the comms from this timetable were about how to handle the data on Apples. So for the guy who created the Apple II to be the undisputed king of Tetris for those years. Clearly a comm. Moreover, Nintendo would only show his scores after the first one when he mirrored his own name to hide his identity. That little detail is why the video is titled Ivet's Kinzo, and it tells us the comms are about surveillance as it can be used to represent the mirrored imaging. Like watching someone far away on a camera. Also, it gives the day he got his world high score of Tetris. July 26, 1990. Steve Wozniak 15-year high score date. July 26, 1990. Apple chip deal in Colorado outbound. This could be coincidence, but when I searched the date this was the only big Apple news for some time. Given the point was in data exchange and tied to Colorado, I'd say this is relevant. Remember the connection with Nintendo and Seattle. March 30, 1976. 5th NFL expansion draft Seattle Seahawks. April 1, 1976. Apple formed in parents' garage. The business coordination with baseball comms typically are associated with setting up a base with blackmail, baseball diamond. September 26, 2017. World's biggest uncut diamond sells for $53 million. September 27, 2017. Hugh Hefner death reported. The vulnerability of these blackmail ops is to MK ops. Throwaway murderers are akin to the famous Shining scene where Jack wants to take the baseball bat. The goal is to get the bat. I.e. the ones playing MK cards trying to take with violence the bases. The conditioning is represented with another famous scene. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, which Jack writes over and over for weeks. Recognizing this threat is when the confrontation happens. The other aspect of the conditioning is getting him drunk. He has a drinking problem that leads him into violence. The ones that seek to use a killer get him drunk. All the while feeding him the idea of who needs to be targeted so that he chooses himself to act against them. The identity of who is funding his addiction is a major topic in the books. Given the hotel literally dates to the Mi-6 creation and is managed by the original James Bond, it's not hard to make some conclusions. Notice the name is Ullman as the manager. This explains the Tracy Ullman comms as the Simpsons origin. Which if you read any of those decodes of mine it connects some big dots. April 5, 1987. Hornets NBA team announced. April 5, 1987. Tracy Ullman debut, Simpsons origin. April 5, 1987. Married. With children. Simpsons comms are about handling nuclear material. Just like the DOE. Represented with a rich man monitoring a middle-class man who sets terrible examples for his son. This is the MK parenting method. The parents intentionally raise their children incorrectly, but most of what they do is nothing. The networks of clowns handle the bad influence, leaving the parents in the clear legally. Watching early Simpsons with this understanding clarifies why he acts the way he does. Why in the very first Ullman shorts he goads Bart into doing something stupid that causes him pain, yet keeps doing it. DOE equals DOE. The daughter with the star haircut is the one that shines. Notice in the short above she works with the father to encourage bad decisions. In The Shining, Jack is sent to kill his son specifically because he uses the shining to include someone the hotel dislikes. The mother is also targeted, Shelley, as in going after the plants that act as shells for others. The shining is defined as being able to speak without speaking. Seeing the future and past. It's just using comms. This is why the kid says he has a ghost that lives in his tooth. You remember the teeth, right? So these people who are the intended next stars get targeted as they try to shine, removing teeth. This ties into many of the other famous moments in the film. Possibly the most famous when Jack breaks down the door and quotes Johnny Carson. Late night shows exist to create stars. So they pick a weak-minded person and then brainwash/addict and send them after enemies. They utilize the same blackmail ops for it. This is why the girl that seduces Jack in the hotel starts out attractive but turns ugly after he takes the bait. Setting up psychological traps to turn one against another. He only starts drinking because of it. A threshold is identified to turn someone into a killer, and they keep them at the brink until needed. Then traps are activated, and the target is let loose. In the film the bad room is 217 as into Q, 17. Cause this is 1977 when Q clearance became a thing. Kubrick changed a lot of things and made it room 237, and there are some notable fandom theories as to why. An entire documentary was made about it. For example, the Moon being 237 miles from Earth. The popular idea that Stanley Kubrick helped fake the Moon landing. The documentary is full of nonsense, as most that are allowed to talk are, but sometimes they hide truth behind the nonsense. 40 years after Columbus landed on America, thousands had followed. 40 years after the first transatlantic flight in 1919, thousands had followed. 40 years after the first satellite shot in space 1957, thousands had followed. And yet, 50 years after man walks on the Moon, no person or country has followed, nor even attempted to launch. Do you know the distance of a satellite to Earth? Do you know the distance to the Moon? 150 miles above Earth equals 1961 Mercury orbit shuttle launches. 205 miles above Earth equals 1998-2020 ISS orbit launches. 250 miles above Earth equals 1972-2011 the Space Shuttle orbit launches. 237,000 miles beyond Earth equals 1969 Apollo Saturn launches. In 1969 NASA managed to go 100,000% further than the Space Shuttle ever went. 100,000% increase. Is that a normal advancement? The point is yes, it's fiction. The connection is with Operation Paperclip. Literally was a mission headed by the most prominent Nazi of that operation. Not about launching rockets but about mass deception. And just like the Nazis, Japan was also involved with those secret ops post-World War II. People who would become ghosts as their old lives tied to war crimes were wiped away. 1953, how the CIA overthrew Iran's democracy in 4 days. Understanding the relative popularity of companies and changes helps clarify roles. Especially when they rapidly increase in size. I already went over how Super Mario Bros. Ties into the hockey ops. Why hockey? Shouldn't it have been baseball? The reason reveals an important angle. The hockey comms were 1983 in adding another player, but also June 1983, Nintendo releases Mario Bros. New York Plumbers, which features the first appearance of Mario's brother and two-player mode. June 1983, Keith Hernandez traded to New York Mets from Cardinals. New York Brothers. The connection becomes more clear in the details. Most famous mustache in baseball equals most famous mustache in gaming. Or close to it in both cases. Also has the same color scheme of the original. So this helps clarify why it went Mario Brothers, as in two parties cooperating, and then Super Mario Brothers, as they expanded. The symbol for a mustache is in hiding that nose/nose, as in someone hiding their identity. Same reason Burt Reynolds has a famous one. This fits with the spook ops already described. This is why the most famous game prior to Mario was a game about hunting ghosts in a maze in Pac-Man. May 1, 1952, Adamski UFO sighting. May 1, 1952, Mr. Potato Head debut. Which I remind you of the Shining Maze. The comms of hiding tracks. Navigating comms. A corn/comm maze equals comms maze. They help with ops and in exchange get the help of the media. This led to the domination of the toy market in the 80s. Starting in New York, of course. Which makes me think Mets as a symbol is tied to meeting people. The comms tied to Hernandez help paint some of the major events. November 13, 1989, Keith Hernandez granted free agency. November 13, 1989, Judge rules Nintendo owns home rights to Tetris. Tetris is the most famous Russian game. November 1989. Fall of the Soviet Berlin Wall. November 1989, Tetris, Soviet game about walls. Symbol here with Keith gaining, free agency, connects to cells tied to USSR gaining the same. Russia switched from Maxwell to Nintendo for Tetris, and it became the best-selling game of all time for many years. The implication being a change in affiliation with cells. Changing direction from the former ops of USSR to Japan, and possibly many others. This ties into the Mariners comms, which up until this week I thought only involved Nintendo when Nintendo literally bought the Seattle Mariners. It's clear now it's a deeper rabbit hole. Though Mariners clearly involved represented KGB changes. December 23, 1991, Nintendo of Japan agrees to buy Seattle Mariners. December 25, 1991, Soviet collapse, KGB. The symbol of Reds, Soviet, Mariners with Ken Griffey, KG, father and son are the transition ops. What did the ops amount to in explicit terms? Given Keith represented cooperation of foreign cells, I noticed his unsaid middle name is Barlow, which is the same as Internet pioneer John Perry Barlow. Perry symbolism is tied to opening Japan to the USA. What's interesting about this is during the same time as Keith Barlow's rise, John Perry Barlow was also rising, creating the original Internet hub. This would perfectly explain how Nintendo fits into the Internet comms I've long decoded. The spy ops changed forms a number of times, but for a very long period of time they focused on telephones. The rise of the proto-internet naturally had comms, and it seems like the Mario pipes were a part of it. Red Wings, Gordie Howe. I decoded the Red Wings' return from obscurity, but that was only in recent history. In fact, the most famous hockey player was for a long time considered to be Red Wings' Gordie Howe. Given we know Red Wings tie to MK Ultra. April 13, 1953, CIA officially launches MK Ultra. April 13, 1953, first James Bond novel published. April 15, 1953, Gordie Howe wed sports agent. Marriage symbolism equals multiple parties coming together. Remember Shining Hotel began same day as Me 6 with Bond as manager. And the origin of the program? That'd be Paperclip Spooks, which is probably why. October 16, 1946, Gordie Howe Red Wings debut loses 4 teeth first game. October 16, 1946, Nuremberg executions hangings. Becoming spooks. All told via symbolism to concerned parties of the day. Interesting coincidence is that the consistent number 1 in hockey Wayne Gretzky began his NHL career within a day of Gordie Howe returning to the NHL. Returned with kids and retired a few months later, which tells me they used Gordie to signal the cells that used him as a comm. They lowered the NHL age to accommodate Gretzky, and that connects with Gordie returning with his children to play. The point being to signal the cells that worked with Gordie comms to then have the next generation coordinate under Gretzky. It was an NHL expansion. One unclear aspect of this is what precisely the motivation was. The teams do play a role in things, and given Gretzky's Oilers coincided with the oil shock, it may be that ops were focused on that industry. But without more research and finding a clear pattern, that's just speculation with a small chance at hitting the bullseye with the dart. Technically he was a racer for a few months before the NHL merger that allowed 18-year-olds to play. January 26, 1979, Wayne Gretzky first signed to Oilers. January 26, 1979, Dukes of Hazzard's famous for car jumping involves probation work. Given jump symbolism tied to these ops. Which is of course tied to the foreign ops. Sony. I tend to focus on Nintendo and the comics, but there are others. The biggest player in video games is Sony. Over 10 times the size today and far more than that back in the 80s. How do they tie in? Historically Sony ties to the blackmail, but with different comms than Nintendo. June 7, 1965, Sony and Cher breakout hit recorded, I Got You Babe. June 7, 1965, Sony introduces its home video recorder. Sony equals Sunny and Cher/Chernobyl comms tie into cooperative ops. Sony probably would have been the one chosen in the game's push instead of Nintendo early on, but there was an effort at the time to make VHS instead of Betamax the format of choice. Nintendo sent comms supporting VHS with the redesign, officially meant to invoke VHS style. Instead Sony lost big and Nintendo established itself for a long period of time. That doesn't change the fact that Sony was still way bigger than Nintendo due to a long history at the top. Eventually Sony got into games. It's a famous story most gamers have heard a dozen times. This means it has comms tied to it. Sony began working with Nintendo on a code-named PlayStation. A big disagreement broke out over licensing, and they broke off the collaboration just before launch. This means they produced comms for the merger which are quite telling. The comms for the PlayStation merger took the form of this film. Two aliens named Station merging into one being a critical plot point. After merging they build electronics. The reason why this film was chosen is because of the original film. What message did it send with two idiots and time travel over 56K phone lines? February 17, 1989. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, phone booth equals 56K connection symbol. March 12, 1989. World Wide Web official birth. Remember the Nintendo comms tied to the early internet. The point of these movie comms is in steering the public into a shallow view of history. The internet was a powerful tool to give to info-deprived masses, so comms were set up about how to make it dumb. With that context, it's a perfect symbol with two idiots getting a history lesson through a stoned filter. After the VHS war was won, Sony regrouped and tried to get back into it. They went through the official channels of Nintendo for it, but when Nintendo broke it off they entered the industry and quickly became the market leader. There are plenty of comms tied to that. The most important defection by a wide margin from Nintendo was Square. Hockey comms that year. Mario is put in as head coach. Makes bad calls, embarrassing game against Red Wings. Goalie was Mario's former roommate and demands to be traded to Avalanche so he wins the Stanley Cup. It's all communicated in the details. Can't stand Mario and they part ways. Just like Square and Nintendo at the time. Roommate symbolism is a perfect match, but the most important symbol here that confirms the connection is the team switch to Avalanche. Avalanche just so happens to be the name of protagonists groups in Final Fantasy VII. The game that would cement PlayStation as market leader. A famous goalie to hate Mario and run away to join Avalanche and then win the biggest hockey event of the year right after. Plus in the game you ride the tiny Bronco, in case the Colorado comms with Avalanche weren't clear enough. They had to bring the Broncos into it. The release dates make it more transparent. Breakup of Nintendo/Square happens in comms 1995. May 24, 1996. Final Nintendo game made by Sony for years. June 10, 1996. Stanley Cup won by Avalanche. August 2, 1996. First Square PlayStation game, Tobal No. 1, with FF7 Avalanche demo. That first game was a collab with Akira Toriyama. Which gives a clue on the sides being taken at the time. Remember that at the time Nintendo's CEO literally owned the Mariners. What comms did they send as it happened? May 26, 1995. Nintendo Mariners, Ken Griffey Jr. breaks left wrist. May 26, 1995. Colorado Avalanche team born, Canadian team purchased. We can see the comms predate the official announcements. Giving the comms community an explanation, which in this case was losing to the Red Wings. What makes this even more interesting? July 19, 1991. Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. July 19, 1991. Final Fantasy IV Square. The villains of Final Fantasy IV use the Red Wings as the weapon. Main character begins as Red Wings and defects. Which given it was time to this merger. July 13, 1990. Red Wings fire coach Jacques Demers. Jacques Demers would then be hired and quickly fired to be replaced by Mario in 1995. The same Mario that would screw up play calling against the Red Wings, leading the goalie to the new Colorado Avalanche. This simply means ops were being set up for the new Sony push. The ops they participate in which is then cashed in for media backing. I can't always discern the ops, but it is clear that hockey backers sided with Sony, which allowed them to take the lead from Nintendo. Where does that leave Sega? Consider the PlayStation mascot was Crash Bandicoot by Naughty Dog. A game with an origin tied to a game I'm sure 99.99% of readers have never heard of, Willy Wombat. June 27, 1997. Willy Wombat Sega Saturn. June 27, 1997. Face Off equals replacing faces. This may have been a symbol of switching Sega for Sony. You've probably never heard of Willy Wombat, but then that's the point. The story behind it was bad design. Something Sega's Saturn was notorious for and Sony's was not. The exchange of faces for the backers who suddenly had a much bigger player in Sony courting them. Sony choosing Crash as a mascot as in a car crashing helps clarify intentions. This symbol was clear at launch. September 1995. PSX launch. September 1995. Wipeout. October 1995. Destruction Derby. November 1995. Twisted Metal Car Combat. Car crash game released every month from launch. Why Crash? Consider the context. Character, Crash, is an experiment victim from an evil scientist. MK comms are defined as driving a target. With that, Sony working with NHL fits, and it becomes clear the launch was tied to ops related to MK, but in what capacity? The original comms sent with Crash was in looking at Sonic's rear end. Proctology-focused comms are always about looking at someone's secrets. Notice the other big game for the publisher was Spyro. A dragon plus spy. Dragon being a comm of many people working as one. September 9, 1998. Spyro the Dragon. September 8, 1998. Pokémon Cartoon Debut USA. September 4, 1998. Google founded. 1998 Amazon adopts gold ring logo. The important point is Spyro connecting with Pokémon, as that is a comm I've extensively decoded in relation to MK Spy Ops. This partially clarifies the ops relationship between Sony and Nintendo. I had already decoded Nintendo being tied to the spy ops in many posts. Most notably with the game all about spying on monsters and filling out a Pokédex full of monster information for a local scientist. Symbol of spying and reporting on what? Notice the US show was timed to Spyro, but the Japanese show was timed to Tokyo Big Sight Exhibition Building. Toy Expo connection. Sony broadcasting loudly their intent to spy. Not just Spyro but buying Spider-Man in 1998. Moreover, having Evil Dead director act as director for it. A movie famous for scenes of an evil camera that hunts the protagonist. Cameron equals camera on. It doesn't perfectly answer the difference between the two spy ops, and for that we may need to look at the comms closer. Naughty Dog, a symbol of a disobedient pet. Dogs are used in many ways, including in MK ops as they can represent the op in motion. Penguins are used in comms tied to computers. It's the official mascot of Linux, which is the type of computer a pro would use to spy online without leaving tracks. Covered in more detail in my 322 post. With that in mind. October 19, 1999. Crash Team Racing, Penguin, Slide. October 15, 1999. Fight Club, Penguin, Slide. Movie about home-brew terrorists blowing up buildings. Unnamed, protagonist goes to cave, Penguin tells him, slide. Same week Crash Kart Racing sliding key mechanic with Penguin. MK victims are often symbolized as abortions. As it involves a parent giving up the child to bad people who brainwash them into an early grave. Thus the most famous line from the Fight Club book. I want to have your abortion, said to a terrorist leader in the story. Fight Club main character being tied to a major corporation that investigates car crashes. The release timing suggests both pieces of media existed to mark/support spy ops going on. Spy ops tied to computers monitoring MK cells. Soap iconography implies motive. Cleaning. Much of that is my speculation. The plot involves a man working for a major car company who didn't know he had been funding a terrorist cell. Story ends with wiping away the debt as the terrorist dies. As in potentially an exchange of removing debt for dropping/exposing terrorists. That is similar to the entities flipped at Waco. MK cells are funded covertly. It's possible comms-aware people in those companies were ignorant. If so, these comms/ops may have marked the investigation. Highly speculative, I try to stick to decoding, but certain puzzle pieces require understanding intent. Hard to define. I can't know the intent with the info available, but I can decode parts of it with high confidence. Especially the origin. An evil split personality is an old trope dating back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Which is pertinent to this entire post because January 5, 1886, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde first published. January 18, 1886, modern hockey is born and standardized with the formation of the Hockey Association in England. Man with an evil split personality that commits crimes. Same month hockey begins. Hyde equals Hyde. 1886 Coca-Cola, with cocaine, first sold. 1886 hockey standardized. 1886 Dr. Jekyll Mr. Hyde. A story often interpreted to be about substance addiction. In my Merck post I go into the origins of World War II, in particular the psychology ops fueling it. Cocaine being a shortcut to getting aggression and loss of inhibition. Unlike today with heavy restrictions, back then cocaine was flowing freely. Populace was even encouraged by the most famous medical experts of the day, like Freud, to begin using. The book Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a marker is tied to hockey and cocaine, and this may give the full root. Turning weak-minded people into addicts that can't control themselves. Motivating them to act in a way that is self-destructive but beneficial to the funder. The idea of having a cup be the trophy for a sports contest may well tie into these ops. Speculating, for all I know there's a logical reason they choose that design. I've never heard why, and when obvious questions like that don't get asked. It's often because the answer is a secret. Well, that, or I'm just ignorant about it. I'm no sports expert. Big business. I've been focusing on the ops, but sports itself is big business. Ops are coordinated through them, yes, but they have to maintain a large audience, and that requires a spectacle. A spectacle like Wayne Gretzky, Michael Jordan, or Bo Jackson. I go through sports rigging in many posts. Babe Ruth is the perfect example. The point is his superhuman feats bring in audience. Baseball was exposed 1919 for rigging games, so they just rigged them harder in 1920. This means there are going to be comms coordinating the spectacle. Coordinating the audience draw. Wayne Gretzky became a superstar globally, and this increased hockey viewership exponentially. The same was true of Michael Jordan, but let's stick with Gretzky for a moment. Gretzky became the face of NHL viewer growth. What kind of comms were sent to coordinate that? Gretzky married a unique Playboy cover girl. The only one I'm aware of that doesn't appear nude. Pictures are PG-13. No breasts or front. Which is interesting because the most famous thing about her is the fact that her debut coincidentally was the first ever film to be rated PG-13. PG-13 Playboy plus first PG-13 film. Unlikely as coincidence, but why? This is where context awareness and patterns become crucial. I found the issue and studied the sequence. These comms articles often string several to send a message. In this case, the ones preceding is an article about going to many restaurants to eat. Has massive obese man with large buffet for graphic. Then building a house. This sequence rang a bell for me because I had just finished studying Wayne Gretzky in pop culture. The running gag in his cartoon was being obsessed with eating. Was this a coincidence? If not, what did it mean? Well, the cartoon is simple enough as propaganda. Much like Bo Jackson being presented as superhuman. It was done not just by rigging sports games but in pop culture. Like how the most famous early sports game, Tecmo Bowl, had Bo Jackson as the ultimate cheat code, as they intentionally made his character superhuman. The answer became clear when I dug more into that original PG-13 film. The goal with PG-13 was to bring in teenage audiences. The film, which is about a teenage boy, Willis, meeting the PG-13 girl of his dreams as he enters the adult world, is the marker for PG-13 itself. July 16, 1988. Wayne Gretzky marriage to PG-13 star. July 15, 1988. Akira. July 15, 1988. Die Hard, Willis. Die Hard and Akira both were famously R-rated and established the template for action and anime for decades. The point is getting audiences. Read that original sequence again with the PG-13 wife eating massive amounts of food, building a house, PG-13 star. Symbol of getting people to consume more media. That's what Gretzky did for hockey, what Akira did for anime, and what Die Hard for theaters. The symbol of eating more and more, carving out an audience, building a house, not taking the audience but simply getting people to watch more. The point with marrying the PG-13, getting young people into it. This explains Super Mario World comms, which were focused on eating. This kind of comm might be to say to other media people, we aren't stealing your audience, we are simply getting them to eat more. This ties into cooperation across the board, like with McDonald's. And then, after being the top-selling toy in the world for multiple years, Nintendo throws garbage over their own star by releasing what some argue is the worst movie ever made. Which is not true by a long shot, but it is a comically bad movie. Bad that doesn't happen on accident kind of bad. Nintendo saying they won't butt in on the territory of movie studios. Which is why it's interesting the new film is supposed to be good, but I'm getting off topic from hockey. The point with all sports remains as a vehicle for comms to coordinate ops. The vehicle itself still has to be sold to the public. So they used comms to coordinate both to rapidly increase media consumption. This growth has been consistent over decades. The point was in building a house, as in getting people to routinely watch hockey and basketball in the same way they had already been prepped for baseball and football. Baseball did it through Babe Ruth, basketball through Jordan and Bird, and of course hockey through Gretzky. This explains Mike Jordan, king of basketball 80s/90s. Mike Jackson, king of pop 80s/90s. Mike Tyson, king of boxing 80s/90s. Mike equals microphone. 3 different microphones, 3 tops of industry, 3 houses built for comms. I speculated to answers to the riddle of their connection in past posts, but only now did I solve it. I racked my brain about ops and what it could mean in relation, but the answer wasn't connected to specific ops, but the relationship as vehicles for them. Conclusions. I covered 2 major basketball teams last week. They both had their popularity in relation to narratives. Comms spinning the world like a basketball. They coordinated 2 major pushes by the media, likely not coordinating the media itself but the necessary ops to create the media. As in coordinating the excuses necessary for the media to report. What I decoded this time with the NHL demonstrated comms that were more tied to the removal of enemies. Baseball, on the other hand, with the taking of bases. Dodgers' origin is with the bridegrooms getting married. There are many scary entities out there, and to dodge, sometimes people marry into the family. Game is played on a baseball diamond, shining star, represented utilizing gaining allies/territory. The blackmail way. Stealing bases, specifically stealing home base. Nickname was the Georgia Peach. Stealing bases by getting people. Along with Babe Ruth comms being a well-known symbol for attractive girls, the baseball base. Football I've decoded tied to information exchange ops, which ties into the foreign football in the same way. The uniqueness of American football is tied to the control of the reserve currency. All sports are about funding ops, but America is unique in that it has the Fed and control over the base currency used everywhere. This is why the football is an egg more than it is a ball. The other major comm I've seen consistently with football is about evidence, which is really a subset of info trading comms, but very specific. Most famous football player Brady. August 3, 1977. Tom Brady born. August 3, 1977. MK Ultra hearing. Symbol of holding evidence that would get someone arrested. Tom B. Raider. September 26, 1969. Brady Bunch. September 26, 1969. Abbey Road Beatles only Beatles album sleeve to show neither artist name nor title. Symbol of staying anonymous. This was also the breakup album, which I now take the lack of naming as some kind of agreement for anonymity. This was as he joined with Yoko Ono Japan, which brings this point almost full circle, but I can bring it fully all the way around. Carrie with the maskless symbolism curiously also did not sport the author's name. This brings us full circle. I'm still working out the symbolism of many of these things. In another post I speculated about the meaning of Abbey Road as it connected to the Beatles' breakup, and yet to this day I've yet to spend the necessary time digging into old articles and song lyrics to be confident about it. Always so many things to dig into, my methodology involves rapidly looking at connections and finding patterns. I find many strong ones and come to a handful of big conclusions, but mixed in with those are a few guesses that are one connection where I pose nothing more than a hypothesis that fits my expectation. Sometimes I never find another chain in the pattern, and other times months later I find the correct pattern and present it. Most often whatever my original theory was had part of the answer, but misunderstood some part. That's what any reader has seen consistently over the past years here. I could increase accuracy exponentially by exploring every link at length, but it would mean I'd only have gotten a fraction of the distance I've managed. I think what I'm doing is working, so I'll continue. But I do need to always remind you to think critically, because not all of these connections are meant to be strong. You need to decide for yourself what to believe, because anyone can be programmed, and what I try to do here is help you transcend that. In this post I don't think I've fully decoded sports, but I do think I now have a bead on the basics of the big ones. If you'd like to try it yourself, let me give you a few of my finds I'm probably going to go through in future posts. November 19, 2014, Kickstarter begins for Hollow Knight, formerly named Hungry Knight. November 19, 2014, The Hungry Names, on The Tonight Show. November 21, 2014, Hunger Games Mockingjay released. I don't know what this means, but I doubt it is coincidence. A game about tiny bugs where you fight a hornet that uses needle and string? I'll probably dig into it within a few weeks, but if you feel like impressing me, give it a try yourself. I was impressed by the game and am working through it. Another one is I've been looking through famous indie games. September 12, 2021, Gaga Meet Dress to Protest, Don't Ask Don't Tell. October 20, 2010, Super Meat Boy. If you've read my Gaga decodes, you know her symbol is that of a gag order. Note her tattoo, which has a message that threatens death to rats that talk. A rat that gets beaten up with a poem about risking life to talk. Given this a game about hyper-violence where the villain is a fetus in a jar. Seems MK World. But why does it connect to Don't Ask Don't Tell? I need to decode the history probably to figure this mystery out. It may be relevant that Super Meat Boy has the same initials as Super Mario Bros. His other famous game is a parody of Legend of Zelda, but involves an abused child having delusions until he suffocates from a lack of air. I feel like I can solve this with a bit of time. I just haven't spent any on it yet, so this is a good opportunity for you to try it yourself, and if you beat me to it, that'll impress me. I should give an example of how to solve an indie game, shouldn't it? Okay, here's a quick one I had been planning on going through. A not very famous indie game. Night in the Woods, a game involves that focuses on a main character having a string of panic attacks and crisis after quitting college 2 years in. Notice the date February 21, 2017. Hillary Clinton was supposed to win the election. Her biggest push to people of the age to play indie games was about forgiving student loans. Clinton didn't win, so the game wasn't elevated to the likes of Super Meat Boy and Hollow Knight as I suspect it might have. I suspect it would have had more emphasis on the debts accrued as it ties to her constant panicking. I haven't fully decoded this one, I'm just using it to highlight a good methodology. It's connections like this that will have the most luck in finding patterns. So even if I'm wrong about the connection, this is still the right way to think to solve stuff like this. Understand the atmosphere and reconcile the symbols in the game. Most of the time directly, but in cases like this the expected situation which was drastically different. This is a good stopping point. Usually I give updates, but I'm trying something new here. Smiley face. If I get a big response, which I doubt I will, then I'll continue doing these partial decodes to give you a chance at them. Either way I'll probably bring back updates next time. I see a lot of good construction work going on now. Winking face. Telegram chat. Join the Decoding Blog Telegram group. Begin decoding. Send leads. This has been NHL, Scary Mask Deconstruction.